So as we continue to drill down on this on credit, this chapter is choosing a source of credit, the cost of credit alternatives. We're weighing the cost of credit, and we're past the point of whether or not the credit is something that's advisable or not. That always goes without saying that you want to consider all these things, but ultimately what it comes down to is back to our concept of opportunity cost. We want for you, for all of us rather, to be able to receive the best deal possible so far as the credit is concerned. The best terms, the lowest all-in cost, if you will, of that credit. So that's kind of the objective in this chapter, is to kind of sort through those, the various types of credit that are available. So learning objective 1, analyze the major sources of the consumer credit. So first thing, of course, is to identify what it is that we're talking about. What kind of credit, what types of credit are available. Secondly, determine the cost of credit by calculating the interest using various interest formulas. This is where the rubber hits the road, if you will, meets the road, in terms of determining what that cost is that we were talking about, how much it's going to cost you on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, over the life of the loan, if you will. And the next piece is to kind of putting it together in terms of developing a plan to manage those debts, your overall debt, because debt is a reality. It's not, if you can get through without debt, if it makes sense, then that's by all means. But most people do incur some debts over their life, and it's just again something that we talked about before. It's a reality, is that we do incur debts, and the objective again is to manage those debts to leverage them, if you will, in your best to your best benefit. Anyway, so onward, evaluating the various private and governmental sources that assist in consumers with debt problems, because again, many people do reach the point where their debt, their spending is kind of, it goes out of control and things happen. It's not just people acting irrationally or unwisely. It's oftentimes there are external forces that happen, such as you might lose your job through no fault of your own. It's not like you would be, perhaps you were let go because of economic conditions, etc. So finally, assessing the choices in declaring personal bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is a financial option, which you reach the point where, one, you're unable to pay your debt off, or excuse me, to meet the requirements of your debt on a monthly type basis, or whatever term you're talking about, and two, so there's that part where you have run into like a short-term issue between jobs, etc., and a longer-term issue, meaning that there's no way that you could ever possibly repay that debt. So those are kind of two types of bankruptcy, Chapter 7, Chapter 11, and we'll get into those as we go forward. So sources of consumer credit, analyze the major sources of consumer credit. What kind of loan should you seek? The most inexpensive loans, perhaps, and I say that guardedly, would be from your parents or family members. The next set that we're talking about, loans that use your financial assets as collateral. And that's through your financial institutions. For example, if you're going to borrow against your CD, or holding your savings in as collateral. Collateral, what that means is, and there's also whole life insurance, which is another topic we'll get into in greater detail as we go forward. But collateral is that if you're going to borrow, you're going to borrow against something else. So if you own a car, for example, and the value of the car is, we'll say, $2,000, and you're going to take a loan out in the amount of, I don't know, $500, $2,000, whatever. you would be holding your car as collateral, meaning that if you can't pay your debt, then the debt holder, if you will, the creditor, would be able to take that car. Anyway, medium, so those are the relatively low price loans. The medium and expensive loans, medium price loans, commercial banks, and this is uncollateralized, and you'd be borrowing from the depositories, the commercial banks, savings and loan credit unions, and then more expensive loans. So those are the financial intermediaries that we spoke of earlier. The more expensive loans would be through check cashing companies, retailers such as car or appliance dealers, and that all this depends on your credit, and the availability of credit for you, and so on and so forth. But these tend to be a bit more expensive. Bank credit cards and cash advances against those credit cards, always have to be wary of that, because typically, even if it's a low rate, a teaser rate is the expression, chances are, if you don't pay the loan back, if you will, against that credit card within that time frame specified, then you get hit with a ton of interest. Okay, tax refund loans, and these are all receiving loans in advance of some payment that's coming to you, and they can be very, very pricey. So the cost of credit itself, so determining the cost of credit by calculating the interest. So these are all things that are set up in protection of the consumers, of you and I. So truth in lending law is a federal law that requires creditors to disclose the APR, or the annual percentage rate. And so the APR is, and we'll get into this, of course, is that's like the all-in cost of whatever. So there's a stated interest on a loan, but there could be other fees and so on and so forth that are associated with it, and that all has to be rolled up to give you a total cost figure, and that's where that APR, or the annual percentage rate, comes in. Finance charges is the total dollar amount you pay to use credit. It includes interest costs, service charges, credit-related insurance premiums, or appraisal fees. And these are the things that flow into that APR that we just mentioned, okay? So there are a lot of additional costs other than the stated interest rate that you would be paying. So again, the APR is a percentage of cost of credit on a yearly basis, and again, it's yearly because it's annual percentage rate. You're key to comparing costs regardless of the amount of credit or how much time you have to repay it. APR, again, is the true rate of interest, so you can compare rates with your other sources of credit. So you can always say, okay, what is the APR for this? What is the APR for this next option? So on and so forth. So whereas there are some limits to this, but the law does not set interest rates. These are driven by markets and by these various financial institutions, and all depending upon competition, really. So if you are a very, very good credit risk, meaning you've got no problems with your credit history, and you've got a very high credit rating, the FICO that we mentioned before, chances are you will be able to, one, get loans that are relatively inexpensive, low interest rate, low APR, and you'll have plenty of options. Whereas the worse your credit rating is, the higher that interest rate goes. So this is all a matter of managing that. And this is what when you're shopping, this is what this is when you're looking at the APR. At any rate, the law does not set interest rates or other credit charges, but it does require disclosure. So you do have to be able to, your potential lender, for the folks from whom you're borrowing, because that's really what this is, have to be front and center and tell you exactly what that APR is, what that total cost, the all-in cost of your credit is going to be. Here come the trade-offs. Term versus interest costs. Longer loans with smaller monthly payments result in more total interest. So again, it's that time value of money, the time that your lender is away from his or her money, the higher the interest rate is that they're going to be charging you. So if you buy a car on 36-month term versus a car on a 60-month term or 72-month term, 6 years, the longer the term, the higher the interest rate. Typically, this is the case. Okay. So lender risk versus interest rate risk rather. Some ways to reduce the lender's risk and your interest rate, accept a variable interest rate. What that means is that we've already talked a bit about inflation. So in the presence of inflation, what happens is that if you have a set interest rate, if there's inflation, and let's just say you've got a 5-year loan, and the 5-year loan is at 5% annual APR, right? So if the inflation rate that's out there when the loan is made is at, we'll say it's 0%, so there's no inflation, so the 5% is a straight number. And let's say that a year or two into the loan, the inflation rate goes up to 5%. So that nominal APR, that nominal annual percentage rate was at 5%. But if you factor in inflation of 5%, that reduces the value, if you will, of that 5% down to what? APR of nominal APR, what's stated on the loan itself is at 5%. And if you have a 5% inflation, that reduces the real, this is the term, real interest rate or the real APR down to 0, right? So it's, again, this is very, very straightforward. That's accepting the variable interest rate. What happens is that you're sharing that potential with the lender, between the lender and the borrower. Meaning you in order to make that more palatable for you, a variable interest rate is typically a bit lower than what would be the fixed interest rate. So you've got variable and fixed interest rates. Provide collateral to secure the loan. Again, this is that backup that you can use to collateral, with the collateral, something that you can use to back up that loan. Making a large cash down payment up front so that you have a larger equity stake ownership in whatever it is, that asset that you're trying to purchase, if you're buying a car, the larger the down payment, the typically lower the interest rate, and so on and so forth. And accepting a shorter term loan. Again, a 36-month loan for a car, 3 years, or versus a 6-year loan for a car, right? 72 months. Okay, so onward, calculating the cost of that credit itself, simple interest. And again, when we're looking at interest computed on a principal only without any compounding that's involved, without adding on over and over. So we're looking at a fixed period of time and what the straight simple interest would be. The dollar cost of borrowing interest rate is equal to the principal times the rate of interest times the time. So I equals P, principal, times R, the rate of interest, and T, the time. Very, very straightforward. Simple interest in a declining balance is used when more than one payment is made on a simple interest loan. Interest is paid only on the amount of the original principal not yet repaid. The more frequent are your payments, the lower the interest rate you will pay overall, is what we're talking about, right, as we're going forward. So example here, and we'll walk through these, and these are things that you should be very, very much aware of, and it's simple to figure out. But it's a process of going through these exercises on your own and becoming more acquainted with them. So again, I suppose your relative, your Uncle Vinny, lends you $1,000 to purchase a new laptop computer. Nice laptop, right? Your relative agreed to charge only 5% interest, and you agreed to repay the loan at the end of 1 year. So straightforward calculation. Interest equals price times the rate of interest and the time. So the interest is equal to $1,000, the price that we're talking about, the overall amount, and then at 5%, 5% interest is 0.05 times 1 year equals $50. Again, straightforward. That's how much the interest you owe in addition to what? That $1,000 principal. So add-on interest. Interest is calculated on the full amount of the original principal. Then this interest amount is immediately added to the original principal. Then the total interest plus principal is divided by the number of payments to be made to arrive at the overall payment amount. When more than one payment is made, this method results in an effective interest rate of higher. This is where that APR piece of it comes in. This method results in an effective rate of interest higher than the stated rate of interest. Okay, that's where, again, the stated rate of interest, and then there's the APR comes into play. So this is add-on interest. Cost of open-ended credit. So credit cards, this is pretty straightforward. Department store, charge cards, etc. Creditors are required to let you know the APR and how the finance charge is actually calculated. So the adjusted balance method, payments are subtracted before calculating finance charges. Again, straightforward, payments are subtracted before calculating finance charges. Previous balance method, payments are not subtracted when calculating finance charges. This is where we start getting into the weeds and the finer details, but it's, as they say, the devil is in the detail, and especially when we're talking about interest rates, you have to be very careful about how these interest rates are calculated on what number, that principal, that large number that we're talking about, how the interest rate is actually calculated. So example of the previous balance method, again, APR is 18%, which is not atypical, unfortunately. It's very high, oftentimes with credit cards. So that breaks down into a monthly rate of 1.5%. That's 18 divided by 12 months in the year, right? So the previous balance was 400 and the payments amounted to 300. The finance charge, again, based on the previous balance, is that overall $400. So it's 1.5% times the 400, which gets us to $6. So this is where a lot of these costs are hidden, if you will. So cost of open-ended credit, this is average daily balance method, the fairest method of computing finance charges. Creditor adds your balances for each day in the billing period, then divides the total by the number of days in the billing period. Then they multiply this average balance by that monthly, again, monthly interest rate. So it's that monthly portion of that 1 year. New purchases during that billing period may be included or excluded. Again, it all depends on what's stated in the agreement from the average daily balance calculation. All right, so here's back to the last piece we're looking at is a 2-cycle average daily balance method. So this gets into these are great details that you've got there, not great, but it gets into great detail, if you will, so far as how that interest is calculated. We have to be very, very much aware of this when we're looking at credit cards. So the 2-cycle average daily balance method could include or exclude rather new purchases. Method of computing finance charges. It uses the average daily balance for 2 consecutive billing cycles, and this is something that was banned in the Credit Card Act of 2009. Grace period. Creditors must tell you when the finance charges begin. This is absolutely imperative. You purchase that computer on credit at the beginning of the month, and your billing doesn't. Your billing cycle is 1 month, and so what that means is that starting on the first day of the next month, for example, what is calculated in that interest? Do you have a month grace period where you don't pay any interest? Or is it one of the others methods that we had talked about where they do charge interest over that 1 month? The grace period, it's very clearly stated, and you have to make sure you're very much aware of that. So cost of credit, inflation, taxes, we've already talked a bit about some of these things, and this is where we kind of drill down on that a bit more. But the cost of credit and expected inflation. Everyone is aware of inflation, both the borrower and the lender. Borrowers and lenders are concerned about the goods and services that dollars can buy, the purchasing power of the dollars rather than the actual credit used. Inflation erodes the purchasing power. There are all kinds of theories that go along with this, but this is very, very basic. Inflation takes away from your purchasing power. And we're always looking, when we're talking about credit, we're always looking about going forward. You're taking some money right now, but you're going to be paying it off over a period of time. And it's that period of time that we're talking about where both borrower and lender have to really, really focus, not just on the principal that you borrowed, but that, that repayment over that period of time. Each percentage point, so each percentage point, we've already mentioned this before, increase in inflation means a decrease of approximately about 1% in the quantity of goods and services you can purchase with that dollar. Straightforward. Inflation goes up by 1%, that reduces your purchasing power by what? By 1%, by that same 1%. We use that as a kind of rule of thumb, straightforward as can be. So the cost of credit and tax considerations, interest paid on consumer credit is not tax deductible. If you have a business and it's associated with your business, the credit that you're borrowing, so a business credit then is tax deductible, or in general is tax deductible, but not so for a consumer. Keep that in mind. So that cost is going to be borne by you entirely. So minimum monthly payment trap. This is something that it's very clearly stated in credit cards now. Again, I don't know the act that was involved with it, not the Truth in Lending Act, but something more recent, where there's a minimum required payment, right? And if you pay that minimum required payment, it's going to take you a certain amount of time to repay that loan, if you will, that credit card balance. So this is a payment trap because it can go for a very, very long time and take a long time again in order to get rid of that debt that you owe if you're just paying the minimum payments. So the minimum monthly payment is the smallest amount you can pay and remain in good standing. If you make only the minimum payment each period, you will pay more interest and it will take longer to pay off the balance. Very straightforward. So here's the example. You purchased a $2,000 sound system. Nice sound system, right? Using a credit card interest with 19% and a 2% minimum payment. If you pay just the minimum payment every month, it will take you 265 months or 22 years to pay off the debt, and will cost you nearly $4,800 in interest payments. So you're paying off the debt. This $2,000 sound system, you're paying an additional $4,800 over the life of that loan if you just pay off the minimum amount on a monthly basis. Not advisable. Again, that's why they call it the monthly payment trap. Early repayment and credit insurance. Early repayment, the rule of 78 favors lenders. The formula requires that you pay more interest at the beginning of the loan when you have use of more of the money, and pay less and less interest as the debt is reduced. So we'll get into that in a second. So credit insurance ensures the loan is paid off in the event of death, disability, or loss of property. 3 types include credit life, credit accident and health, and credit property, and the premiums associated with that are quite high, which means in essence that the first part, the early repayment, is it helps the lender, so the lender doesn't lose out quite so much because the interest rates are paid more up front, or that most of the interest rather is paid up front. These were always things to watch out for with mortgages in the past, more so than today, but at any rate, this is again where APR comes into play. And so far as the credit insurance is concerned, it's one of those things that with insurance, whenever you're talking about insurance, you almost don't, well, to be very blunt about it, you don't want your insurance ever to kick in, because your insurance is usually paid out in the event of your demise or in the event of you becoming disabled and not being able to pay bills and so on and so forth. So it's added insurance for other people is really what it is, at least in theory. Okay, onward. We'll get to that later when we get into insurance. So the Credit Card Act, the Act of 2009, limits the increases in APR in the first year. So this is again trying to offset or prevent that the higher interest rate earlier on in the life of the loan. Restricts issuers from charging higher interest rates on existing balances. So once you purchase something that and the interest rates go up, it can't change on those balance, that outstanding balance that you have. Teaser rates, again, this is where we talked about before. You have a very low interest rate. That in this case, we're saying that due to this Credit Card Accountability Responsibility, or the CARD Act in 2009, teaser rates must be effective for at least 6 months. So typically it's, I've seen them as long as 24 months, but 6 months, meaning that you may have 1 or 2% interest for those 6 months, for example, but then in month 7, it jumps up to 21%, something very high. So always be careful of these teaser rates. Always consider and hope that before you jump on a teaser rate that you actually pay off that debt within that prescribed time frame. It's basically a bet that you won't, so far as the lender is concerned, because they want you to carry balance going forward and to pay a much, much higher interest rate, of course. Anyway, it's very straightforward. Issuers must mail statements at least 21 days before payment is due. And now things online, it falls in the same category, and but there has to be some leeway or some prior notification that when the balance, the payment is due. The disclosure statements have to be made clear and timely. And again, that also speaks to APR and grace periods. All these things go along with it. Card issuers must post agreements on the internet. Okay, meaning they've got to make sure that all of the boilerplate, if you will, has to be out there, available online for you to see, which is normal now. Okay, it's all very straightforward. So it requires statements to report the due dates, potential late fees, all the things that are about this, and typically it's on the one page. Everything is just kind of in there, out there for you to see. It's very, very, very straightforward. Sets a consistent due date, the 15th of the month, end of the month, and all the requirements that kind of go into that. Restricts the penalties for going over the credit limit. Prohibits card issuers from issuing cards to consumers under 21 without a cosigner or independent means to repay debt, meaning that it increases the access. Or it controls rather that access of that. It's in some cases it feels more restrictive, but there's some wisdom in all of this, because especially when you're young, you have no idea of how credit really, really works, and this kind of speaks to that. It gets to that. This is why it's difficult for people that, for example, under the age of 25 to rent a vehicle, because there's no history, and it's something that you don't want to jump into without having that credit history, without having a good credit history. And these are just wise things that are set up out there that make a lot of sense. They can be restrictive and people wonder why, but again, most of this has to do with past experience. So onward, managing that overall debt. Now that we've figured out what kind of debt we're going to do, use, what kind of credit cards, so on and so forth. So now it's a matter of managing that debt that you've established. So develop a plan to manage that debt. first and foremost. And this is something that people, when they run into trouble, they don't let their creditors know. And you really, really have to do that. You have to notify people to let them know that you're running into trouble, so you can describe the trouble to them and try to address it without it becoming a bad mark, if you will, on your credit, your overall credit. So if in essence, then, this is an example. If automobiles are repossessed, you owe the difference between the selling price and the unpaid debt, in addition to the legal, towing, and storage charges. And people don't realize that. And I'll be very straightforward about this. You get yourself into a vehicle, meaning you buy a vehicle, maybe a new vehicle for $25,000, for example, and you go through the sales pitch and the whole routine, and it looks like you're able to afford that $25,000 vehicle, and you start paying for that, and you realize very quickly that you're way, way over your head. And two problems. One is that the value of the vehicle has dropped significantly from when you first purchased it. And there's kind of a rule of thumb: if you take a car off if you buy a car and drive it off the lot, you lose 20%. That's whether or not that's actually the case. It's a good rule of thumb, meaning that $25,000 vehicle is worth only 80% of the value. So it's been knocked down to what we'll just say $20,000 after you drive off the lot. The problem with that, of course, is that you've been paying for this vehicle for 2 or 3 months, and the expression is underwater. And this is why you have to contact people and let them know, because if, say, for example, you cannot pay the note and you don't pay the note and the vehicle is repossessed, the dealer or whoever is repossessing the vehicle comes in and with a tow truck, and all the costs that are associated with that, the legal fees, the towing fees, the storage charges, etc., are the overall the unpaid portion of that vehicle. For example, you still owe again close to $25,000, and the vehicle sells for $20,000, and on top of that you've got an additional $2,000 of legal and towing and storage charges. So you're in the hole for what, another $7,000. So this is something to really be careful about when you're purchasing a new car. Anyway, I won't into too much detail on that, but you get the idea. So there are regulations, guidelines, so on and so forth out there. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act regulates debt collection agencies, and these are interesting folks. So if a debt collector calls you within 5 days, you must send a written notice of the amount. They must rather send a written notice of the amount owed, the creditor's name, and the right to dispute the debt. Outlines your rights as well. You can dispute the debt or pay it, basically. If you dispute the debt, you may request verification of the debt within 30 days. If not sent, you can insist that there is communication about the debt. The communication about the debt itself ceases to stop bugging you, in essence. If verification is sent, you may pay the debt or give notice that you will not pay. So there are legal steps that are involved with this. At any rate, warning signs of debt problems. So these are the red flags, if you will, that pop up. Paying only minimum balances each month on credit cards that we've already talked about. That's a dead end, if you will. And sometimes you have months where you can only pay the minimum amount, and that's fine. Or you carry balances forward. So you have $1,000 outstanding in your credit card, and you've got a month where you're changing jobs again or something like that. So you really you can't pay more than the minimum amount. And as soon as you get the new job, you start paying higher, more, so you can reduce the balance more quickly. At any rate, So this is a sign, though, that you're running into trouble if you can only pay the minimum balance each month on an ongoing basis. And on top of that, increasing the total balance due each month. So continuing to borrow more and keeping that minimum balance, keep paying the minimum balance. Missing or alternating payments or paying late. Again, these are all signs. These are all troubling signs, and we've seen this happen often. And it does. It's very, very, very frequent that you run into problems where people are not able to pay, but they pay. They're either paying late or they're missing a month's payment. Intentionally using overdraft protection or taking a few frequent cash advances. Using savings to pay routine bills such as food, meaning that your savings is dropping as a result of paying these routine bills, these routine monthly bills. This is also a troubling sign. Receiving second or third payment notices, shut-off notices, all these things that come. Not talking to your partner about money or talking only about money, meaning that you're in this together. So you have to be able to share this back and forth on both sides so that you both have a good sense of where you're at. And it can go from not talking, or they say talking only about money, where people are just complaining about money all the time. And this causes ruined many relationships, if you will, families and so on and so forth. And we all know this. And these are things that we either are aware of personally, or we know of people that have gone through this, depending upon overtime to meet routine expenses. Overtime meaning you're working extra hours, and that's never is that advisable, right? Using up your savings, so drawing down your savings until you've got nothing left, borrowing money to pay old debts. So you're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul is the expression. So you're borrowing more money to pay off some other debts, not knowing how much you actually owe, not having a good idea of how much is actually outstanding. You pay the minimum amount and you ignore what the overall balance is. Going over your credit limit on credit cards, having little or no savings for the unexpected, so you don't have any sort of an emergency fund. You've used it all up. Being denied credit due to a credit report, so you've got a credit report that is your credit is, you've got a bad credit history, and you want to, again, these are things that all warning signs, right? They were talking about getting a credit card revoked by the issuer, putting off medical or dental visits because you can't afford them now. So deferring maintenance on your this is, not only is it not advisable, it's something that can be dangerous if you don't take care of your medical. You've got to take care of yourself first, right? This is paying yourself first. This is going beyond paying yourself first. This is absolutely required. So if you run into these problems, and people do, you've got to really kind of consider where the heck you're at that moment. So frequent reasons for indebtedness, and this is where it becomes very uncomfortable for people. Emotional problems such as the need for instant gratification. And this is very normal, unfortunately, where we need that gratification and we can't make rational decisions. The use of money to punish or get even. And this is destructive in terms of on a personal relationship basis, or even with yourself. It's something that ultimately you're doing yourself a great deal of harm. The expectation of instant comfort among young people who overuse the installment plans, and that's rent to own type of things. It's just buying a new car because you want a new car, and this is where it goes into keeping up with the Joneses. Your neighbor just bought a new car, so you want to buy a new car as well. Overindulgence of children. This happens again very, very frequently, where people are keeping up with the Joneses, but through their children. misunderstanding or lack of communication among family members. If you're not talking to each other about financial things, then chances are, if you're not talking to each other, then you're most likely not talking about financial things. That's even more difficult in some cases. um, Amount of finance charges make it difficult to repay, meaning you want to buy something and you disregard the finance charges and you find out when you have to start repaying. Again, these are things that it's ignoring what's in front of you and the serious consequences of debt. Again, I've already mentioned this, but robbing from Peter to pay Paul can affect family health issues. May result in job loss due to garnishments. Garnishment is when, if you're not paying, your creditor can contact your employer and say, well, this person is not paying their bills and we want to garnish their wages, meaning to take some of their wages to pay those bills. Very straightforward. Don't want to go down that path. May result in neglecting educational needs of children. Heavy drinking, neglect, all these things are just back to they become very, very personal and extremely destructive. Neglect of children, marital difficulties, obviously drug abuse. It happens very frequently and ultimately, or not ultimately, but it may also result in bankruptcy, again, where you're either unable to meet your short-term debt, your debt requirements, or you're never going to be paying off your debt at all. And that's where you get into some real issues. Insolvency, it's called, when you cannot, you're completely unable to pay your debts. So there are things that are available, of course, various private and government sources that can assist consumers with debt problems and education and so on, like this class is in education in dealing with these things. And these are things that are, again, we oftentimes, if we're fortunate, we get a lot of this information from family members or education as we're doing right now, but oftentimes people don't have this. And this is, again, it's very, very important for you to become aware of. It's incumbent, it's required for you to have an understanding of how to deal with these financial things, and there are resources out there that are available. So if you can't pay your bills and need help, talk with your creditors first and try to work out an adjusted repayment plan. And it says or, but you should also seek help with the nonprofit financial counseling program. Talk to people about these things. I'm not saying to talk to anybody on the street, but just find somebody that you can actually talk to about this. It's very, very important. Consumer Credit Counseling Services, or CCC, is typically, and they've got CCCS because they're more than one. It's rather the service piece of it. I've always seen it as CCC, Consumer Credit Counseling, but throw the S on for service. Nonprofit, which is supported by contributions from banks, credit unions, merchants, etc., provides debt counseling services for those with serious financial problems. Helps families or aids families by helping set up realistic budgets and providing education about credit buying and budgeting. And they can also administer a debt repayment plan, meaning they take kind of control over your budget, is really what it comes down to, so that they can organize your finances so that you're able to pay your outstanding debts, your outstanding ongoing, reducing your debt, etc. How to choose a credit counselor, what services do you offer? These are questions to ask, of course. Do you offer free information? What are your fees? Because everything costs something. There's some costs that are associated with this. I say that guardedly because there are some free services out there, but you have to really be careful. How will this debt management plan work? Can you get my creditors to lower or eliminate my interest and fees? This is the negotiation process, because two things. One, you've gotten yourself into a situation it's very difficult to try to claw yourself out. That's one. And the two, your creditors are looking at you and saying, well, you're the one that got yourself into this, and how am I going to trust you to get yourself out? Whereas if you have a third party sometimes they can step in on your behalf with their separation from you, actually, and having some history in doing this in the past of success. They have much more credibility with your creditors, unfortunately, but it's true. What if I can't afford to pay you? How does it work? What are the payment options? Will you help me avoid future problems? Is this an ongoing relationship? Will we have a contract? Are your counselors accredited or certified? Are these folks that are helping me with air quotes, helping me? Are they really qualified or to do that? So there are alternative counseling services, again, universities, colleges, classes like this, of course. Local county extension agencies, credit unions are very good about this, military bases, and oftentimes employers, especially if you're talking about military and state federal housing authorities. You can check with your bank or consumer protection office to see if it has a list of reputable low-cost financial services. So contact your credit union, your bank, and see what the resources are that are available for you. And recognizing that there's, one, things happen. Two, there's nothing to be ashamed of. And three, you are acknowledging that there is an issue and you want to address that issue. So at any rate, nonprofit American Credit Counseling website is consumercredit.com. It's very straightforward. Be aware of deceptive credit counseling organizations. You always hear these ads for these folks on the radio or see them online, etc. So you just have to be very, very wary of declaring burst. Now we're going into the bankruptcy. So assess the choices in declaring personal bankruptcy. Bankruptcy itself is a legal process in which some or all of your assets of a debtor are distributed among the creditors because the debtor is unable to pay his or her debts. Very straightforward. Someone steps in, legal authority, the judge, if you will, bankruptcy court, etc., where they determine what your assets are and what is your ability to repay the debts that you have. So someone has to step in and do this. So declaring bankruptcy is a last resort because it severely damages your credit rating. 7 years, and probably more, I think but we'll get into the actual details. Increasing numbers of filers are well-educated, middle-class baby boomers. Baby boomers, again, those are the old folks, right? Account for 60% of personal bankruptcies. The average age is 38, more likely to be a female. Women account for 36% of filers. A record 2 million people declared bankruptcy in 2005. This is rather dated, but things haven't changed all that much, if you will. So bankruptcy has unfortunately become an acceptable tool of credit management for some people in particular, meaning that this is something that they go down this path more than once. It's not something that's advisable for your own personal sanity. It's something that's very difficult to have to kind of contend with. This is something that's out there. It's a source of shame for many people. Other people it's not, but it's in general it's something that it's not advisable to do this unless you really, really have to. Let's leave it at that. So this Abuse Prevention Consumer Protection Act of 2005 law requires that executive offices for U.S. trustees develop a financial management training curriculum to educate individual debtors. So you have to go through a training process, if you will. Debtors complete an approved instructional course in personal financial management. Clerk of each bankruptcy district maintains a list of credit counseling agencies, so they're setting this up for you. So you're forced to go down the same path that you should have taken earlier, is really what it comes down to, earlier in this process without getting this far, but it's there, so keep that in mind. Chapter 7, person filing, is called the debtor. Debtor submits a petition to the court that lists assets and liabilities and pays a filing fee known as a straight bankruptcy. Many, but not all, debts are forgiven. Most assets are sold to pay creditors. You can keep some assets, including your home, your vehicle for work, I think. But if you have a boat, for example, that's gone. Anyway, you get the idea. Is that they go some way to try to remedy, to pay off, if you will, the debtors, the outstanding debtors, and your slate is wiped clean. But you have this is the nuclear option. So after Chapter 7 bankruptcies, you still may owe certain types of taxes and fines, child support, alimony, educational loans. So you're never cleared of your educational loans, at least at this point. Debts not disclosed to court, debts from fraud, embezzlements, all the unsavory things that are out there, debts from willful or malicious acts, voluntary plan. This is Chapter 13. This is, I was changed Chapter 7 and 11, I meant Chapter 13, excuse me. So a voluntary plan proposed to the bankruptcy court for those who want to pay a portion of their debt over a period of 5 years. Wage earners plan. So this is setting up repayment plans so that you can pay your creditors over a period of time. So you pay into a trustee. So you're paying to a third party, and then that trustee distributes the money to your creditors, or that third party, if you will. Court may allow you to keep property and pay less than the full amounts of debt. This is all negotiated, but this is again negotiated at the court. You've reached this point of bankruptcy. The costs of the debtor include court costs, attorney's fees, trustees' fees, and other costs. So you're not getting away, as the expression goes, scot-free. Chapter 7, Chapter 13. Those are the two types of bankruptcy. Chapter 7 that's the nuclear option, where everything is wiped out for the most part, but you've lost control completely. Whereas in Chapter 13, you have an opportunity to pay back your debt. In essence, that some of it's wiped away, but you're in a kind of a managed bankruptcy, if you will. So the effect of bankruptcy on your job and future credit. So this is where I had the trouble. So different people have different experiences in obtaining credit after they file bankruptcy. It all depends. It all depends on how desperate your lenders are. Your lenders are. So don't confuse personal bankruptcy with the business. That's where I was getting Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Many people find it easier to complete bankruptcy forms with the assistance of experienced bankruptcy counsel. It's just the nature of it. You have to go through this process. Monetary costs associated with filing Chapter 13 bankruptcy include court costs, as mentioned before, attorney's fees, trustees' fees, and other costs, always with the other cost. Last comments. Bankruptcy is, again, that's the nuclear option. You don't have to go that far. Some people, again, it's not something that they shy away from, but the takeaway from this is that so far as like bankruptcy is concerned, is that you don't have to go that far. You can deal with these things before you reach that point. And the first thing you have to do is what? Come to grips with what your financial situation is. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. All right. So that's a lot of this that we're going through in this class really boils down to having an understanding of what your financial position is at that point in time. All right. So onward we go.